This is also a time of change for my family.
The royal briefing was already underway when Prince William noticed something no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. One unfamiliar aide was standing inside Balmoral, listening to discussions meant for a tightly controlled circle. William did not raise his voice. He simply looked toward his father. Seconds later, Charles stopped the meeting completely, leaving senior staff frozen and one terrifying question hanging over the room. Who had allowed this person inside? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew the meeting could not continue as though nothing had happened. Balmoral, the royal family's private Scottish residence, was meant to offer privacy far from London, yet this room now felt exposed. The royal briefing was a closed strategy meeting where the King, William, Queen Camilla, and approved staff discussed duties, security plans, family movements, and decisions affecting the monarchy. Every person inside was supposed to be known. Every seat mattered. That was why William's silence carried more force than an accusation. William kept his eyes on the stranger as anger tightened beneath his calm expression. The prince understood that upcoming appearances were only part of what had been discussed. Family schedules and security arrangements had also been spoken aloud. Charles felt the danger differently. For the king, this was not merely a stranger in the wrong room. It was a humiliating possibility that someone inside his household had stopped respecting the boundaries around him. Camilla shifted immediately, and William caught it. Her discomfort appeared before anyone had demanded the aide's name. A senior equerry moved toward the attendance sheet. An equerry is a trusted officer who assists the monarch and helps manage official duties, including access around sensitive engagements. He checked once, then again. The stranger's name was missing. The room hardened. When the aide reached toward an inside pocket, a security officer stepped closer, and William's attention sharpened. Camilla spoke quickly, insisting there could be an innocent explanation, but her defense only deepened the prince's suspicion. Charles ended the uncertainty with one movement. He placed his hand flat against the table and ordered everyone to stop speaking. The king then instructed security to secure the doors until the aide's identity, credentials, and authorization were established. No one challenged him. William watched the stranger, then looked toward the faces around the room. That was the moment his concern changed. The question was no longer simply how this man had entered Balmoral. Someone may have made his presence possible. The briefing had stopped, but William's attention was already moving away from the stranger and toward the people who had been standing comfortably beside him. Prince William had spent years learning how royal rooms worked. He understood who stood where, who spoke first, who remained silent, and which faces belonged behind closed doors. That instinct was exactly why the stranger disturbed him so deeply. This was not simply an unfamiliar employee wandering into the wrong corridor. Someone had positioned the aide inside a protected royal conversation, and now William wanted to know whose confidence had made that possible. William did not leave the matter to security alone. As the future king, he had become alert to the machinery surrounding Charles, because one day he would inherit not just ceremonies, but the private system keeping the monarchy functioning. Equerries, secretaries, aides, and household officials formed that system. An equerry was a trusted officer who assisted the sovereign with duties and access. The structure depended on trust. One unchecked person could expose far more than a schedule. Charles listened when his son said the intrusion felt deliberate. The king did not answer immediately, because accepting that possibility meant accepting something more painful. Someone inside his household might have ignored the rules on purpose. William pressed the point carefully. Camilla reacted faster. She became irritated when he asked that everyone present be checked against the official attendance list. To her, the scrutiny sounded less like caution and more like an accusation against people she trusted. Then William remembered something. Earlier that day, He had seen the same unfamiliar face near a private Balmoral corridor, speaking quietly with another staff member. The man had walked away quickly when the prince approached. Now that detail returned with new weight. Security questioned the aide and asked whom he reported to. Instead of naming a superior, he gave only the name of an office. That answer forced officials to trace the access badge itself, following the chain backward. Charles remained behind after the room cleared. He stood by the window, rubbing his thumb against his signet ring, a personal ring bearing a family emblem and traditionally associated with identity and heritage. William joined him without speaking. For several seconds, father and son stood there, both understanding that the problem had moved beyond one stranger. The king finally looked at him. "Find out how he got here." William gave a small nod, but his thoughts had shifted to an earlier gathering at Balmoral, weeks before this briefing. Something had changed then. A boundary had been bent, an exception allowed, and no one had understood the cost. To understand why one uninvited aide could shake the king so badly, William would have to return to the decision that quietly opened Balmoral's doors weeks earlier. The breach at Balmoral did not begin on the morning William spotted the stranger. It began weeks earlier, during a smaller gathering that hardly anyone considered dangerous at the time. One additional advisor was permitted into a private planning session after a last-minute request. Charles allowed it. William objected. Camilla defended the arrangement. What seemed like a minor disagreement became the point of no return, and everyone would remember it differently once the briefing was stopped. Charles had been using Balmoral for quieter internal planning, away from the ceremonial pressure surrounding London and Windsor. Those sessions mattered because they allowed sensitive family schedules, public duties, and private decisions to be discussed with fewer people present. A communications advisor was a staff member responsible for helping shape public messaging and media responses. Camilla had argued that trusted advisors needed more flexibility to move between informal and official conversations, without waiting for layers of approval. 3 weeks before the stopped briefing, Camilla made a last-minute request. She asked Charles to allow one additional communications advisor into a private planning session, even though the person's security clearance had not been completed. William immediately objected. The prince warned that once one exception was allowed, others would follow. The king hesitated, then approved it anyway, believing trust still had to mean something inside his own household. William left that meeting frustrated. Later, he told Charles privately that exceptions become precedents, especially when staff begin assuming yesterday's favor is tomorrow's rule. The king pushed back, saying a royal household could not function if everyone was treated like a threat. Camilla took the disagreement personally. She felt William was questioning her judgment, and her manner toward him cooled. In response, the future king began quietly noting unfamiliar staff appearing near private royal spaces. Then the old household log changed everything. A household log was the internal record used to track staff access and permissions around royal residences. William discovered that the advisor admitted 3 weeks earlier had later sponsored temporary access for 2 additional staff members. One of those names matched the credentials carried by the aide found inside the briefing. William placed the old access sheet on Charles's desk and tapped the matching name once. The king read it, then read it again. He slowly removed his glasses and said nothing. Camilla's earlier request had not proven intent, but it had created the chain. For Charles, that distinction offered little comfort, because the security failure now carried the weight of a family decision. The question was no longer how the stranger entered Balmoral. The question was, who would admit responsibility when Charles finally demanded an answer face to face? Charles did not summon a committee. He did not wait for another report. Once the access records were placed in front of him, the king called the people involved into one room and closed the door. William stood beside him. Camilla entered moments later, Then came the official, whose authorization sat at the center of the chain. What followed was not a palace discussion about procedure. It was a confrontation about trust. Charles had already read the preliminary review twice. The aide had entered Balmoral using legitimate temporary credentials, which meant the problem had not begun with an outsider forcing his way past security. It had begun inside the household itself. A private secretary was the senior official who helped manage the monarch's schedule, correspondence, and sensitive decisions, and this approval had bypassed that office entirely. That made the breach harder to dismiss. Someone had used an internal path, and someone else had allowed it. The king turned to the senior household official and asked one simple question. Why had the credentials been approved without notifying his private secretary? The official hesitated. William noticed it immediately. Charles repeated the question. This time the answer came more slowly. The request, the official admitted, had arrived through a trusted channel connected to Camilla's staff, and previous requests from that direction had rarely been challenged. Camilla reacted at once. She insisted she had never ordered the aide into the briefing, and rejected any suggestion that she had knowingly placed an unauthorized person near sensitive discussions. William did not accuse her of that. Instead, the prince made a colder point. She may not have given the order herself, he said, but people had begun acting as though her approval could be assumed. The queen consort pushed back, saying, trust within the household should not suddenly be treated like misconduct. Then the official revealed the deeper problem. Staff had gradually begun treating certain requests from Camilla's office as automatically acceptable because earlier exceptions had passed without objection. William placed the old access record on the table. It showed the same pattern beginning 3 weeks earlier, when the advisor she had asked Charles to admit received special permission before clearance was complete. Charles pushed his chair backward and stood. He did not shout. That made the moment heavier. The king looked directly at the official and said, "No one borrows the crown's authority because it is convenient." Camilla stared at him, stunned by the force of the rebuke. William remained silent, because the argument had finally moved beyond blame. By the time the door opened again, the argument was over, but the battle over authority inside the royal household was only beginning. Royal power is often imagined through crowns, ceremonies, and signatures. But inside Balmoral, power suddenly came down to something far simpler. Who could open a door? Charles now understood that access itself had become authority. If private staff could extend that access through informal trust, then the king's control was partly an illusion. William wanted the system tightened immediately. Camilla feared what that decision would imply about her own influence. Charles ordered a full review before anyone could soften the problem. Temporary passes, staff sponsorship rights, briefing attendance, and informal permissions would all be examined. Sponsorship rights were the authority certain senior staff had to request access for other employees or visitors, and that privilege had become dangerously loose. William argued that every person entering a sensitive meeting had to be linked to one named official. No vague office, no assumed permission, no quiet exception passed from one desk to another. Camilla felt the pressure almost immediately. Several conveniences connected to her office were suspended while the review continued, and she told Charles that he was turning one failure into a judgment against everyone around her. The queen consort believed the reforms made loyal staff look suspect. The king heard the hurt in her voice, but he refused to retreat. Protecting her from embarrassment could no longer come before protecting the authority of the crown. Then the review exposed something worse. Several earlier access requests had been approved verbally, leaving no clear written record of who had first asked for them. William saw the danger at once. Without a paper trail, responsibility could disappear inside polite conversations and assumed favors. Charles understood it too. Trust had not simply failed at one point. It had spread so widely that nobody could say where permission actually began. A deleted calendar entry deepened the mystery. Investigators recovered a record showing that the uninvited aide had been expected somewhere else inside Balmoral that morning, not inside the royal briefing. That meant his presence in the meeting may not have been planned from the start. Somewhere between his arrival and the closed-door discussion, his path had changed. Charles sat alone with William after midnight and read the preliminary security report again. The king closed the folder and admitted what troubled him most. People had acted as though they carried royal permission because no one had stopped them before. The prince answered quietly that this was exactly why the system had to change. By sunrise, Charles had transformed suspicion into policy, and the consequences began reaching through Balmoral, one office at a time. The next morning, Balmoral felt different. Temporary passes were suspended. Staff were called in individually. Familiar routines vanished without warning. But the deepest shock came when Charles removed certain offices from the automatic approval chain entirely. No one was expelled from the family. No dramatic declaration was issued. Yet the message was unmistakable. Trust that had once been assumed would now have to be earned again. Charles moved quickly, because delay would have made the reforms look optional. Informal access privileges were suspended across the household, which meant even familiar aides now had to pass tighter identity and attendance checks before entering sensitive meetings. William was given a direct role in reviewing briefing security, increasing his practical authority around decisions affecting future royal operations. That mattered because the prince was no longer simply observing how his father's household worked. He was beginning to shape how it would operate. Camilla received the new instruction quietly. Her office could no longer sponsor temporary access to restricted briefings without additional approval. The Queen Consort read the notice twice, then placed it down with trembling hands. For her, the change felt larger than procedure. Charles later found her sitting alone and tried to explain that the restriction was not designed as punishment. She answered that intent did not change the result. Inside the household she had helped support, her judgment now required another person's permission. Security brought one piece of relief. The uninvited aide had carried no recording device, copied no protected material, and removed no documents from Balmoral. Charles heard the finding without celebration. The immediate fear of a deliberate leak had faded, but William sensed that something else was about to replace it. During questioning, the aide gave a documented account of how he had entered the area. Another staff member, he said, had simply told him, "They know you're coming." William understood the weight of those words immediately. The aide had not behaved like someone executing a secret operation. He had behaved like someone who genuinely believed permission had already been granted. When the man was escorted from the Balmoral grounds, the prince watched him leave and felt no sense of victory. The stranger looked confused, not calculating. That changed everything. William no longer believed the aide was the real problem. The deeper danger was a culture where people had begun treating assumed approval as actual authority. He turned to Charles and asked for a private conversation, with no staff, no secretaries, and no advisors present. Once the stranger disappeared beyond Balmoral's gates, father and son were finally left facing the harder truth. The breach had been created by people who believed the rules no longer mattered. There were no secretaries in the room this time, no equerries, no advisors. Just Charles and William, sitting across from one another after a day that had exposed more than either wanted to admit. The prince had spent hours demanding stronger boundaries. The king had spent those same hours discovering how easily his authority had been interpreted by others. Now the argument was no longer about an aide. It was about what kind of monarchy they were prepared to protect together. William chose his words carefully. He told Charles that his concern had never been about controlling every member of staff or turning royal life into a fortress. It was about preventing private authority from being borrowed through friendship, habit, or personal loyalty. The sovereign's private office was the small senior team that directly managed the monarch's most sensitive decisions and communications, and the prince believed that office had to become the final point of approval for restricted meetings. Charles did not argue this time. The king admitted that the household had become too dependent on informal trust, because rigid rules often felt awkward inside a family environment. That system had worked when everyone understood the same boundaries. Now those boundaries had blurred. He also admitted something more personal. Stopping the briefing had humiliated him, yet allowing the meeting to continue after William raised the alarm would have been far worse. William then acknowledged the cost on his side. He hated challenging the arrangement because he knew every objection placed Charles between his son and Camilla. The prince had never wanted security to become another family battle. The king answered quietly that avoiding discomfort was exactly how the problem had grown. Protecting feelings had allowed assumptions to become permission. That admission changed the conversation. Charles agreed that sensitive royal meetings would now use one verified attendance system, ending the overlapping chains that had caused the breach. The king went further. William would automatically be consulted on security rules involving immediate family arrangements and succession matters. Succession meant the legal order determining who inherits the crown, making those conversations especially sensitive. For the future king, this was not merely extra responsibility. It was a clear sign that his judgment now carried greater weight. Charles extended his hand across the table. William looked at it for a moment before taking it. The gesture was brief, almost formal, but it ended the disagreement that had begun 3 weeks earlier. Inside Balmoral, trust had been repaired between father and son. Outside its gates, the country was only beginning to understand why the meeting had stopped. By the following morning, the moment that had unfolded behind Balmoral's closed doors was no longer private. The image was irresistible. William noticing a stranger, Charles stopping a royal briefing, and security suddenly questioning how an unauthorized presence reached a protected meeting. Newspapers framed it as a palace security drama. Broadcasters debated the deeper meaning. And outside Balmoral itself, curiosity turned one quiet royal interruption into a national conversation about trust. Charles disliked the suggestion that his household had descended into disorder. Palace communications, the official channel used to explain royal activity and respond to public questions, issued a written statement confirming that a scheduled briefing had been interrupted after an attendance discrepancy was identified. The statement also stressed that no protected material had been removed. William read the wording carefully. The prince understood why reassurance mattered, but he also feared that growing attention could punish staff whose failures came from careless procedure rather than deliberate betrayal. Camilla felt that pressure more sharply. Commentators began linking the breach to earlier access practices connected with her office, and the queen consort was furious that a procedural failure was being turned into a personal struggle over influence. Charles tried to keep the public response focused on reform, yet she believed the story had already escaped that boundary. William, meanwhile, refused to celebrate his own role. He had noticed the problem, yes, but he knew one dramatic headline could destroy reputations long before the full chain of mistakes was understood. Then came the front page that captured the mood. One national newspaper printed the words, "Who let him in?" above a photograph of Balmoral, turning a private lapse into a national spectacle. A morning broadcaster went further, describing William's intervention as the moment the room realized protocol had already failed. Protocol meant the agreed rules governing official royal conduct and access, and suddenly those rules were being discussed far beyond palace walls. Outside Balmoral's gates, a small crowd gathered as media vehicles arrived. People spoke less about the stranger himself and more about the fact that the meeting had been stopped immediately. That distinction mattered. The public seemed unsettled by the failure, but reassured by the response. Charles then authorized a formal statement confirming a new access review process across sensitive meetings. The king was not pretending nothing had happened. He was turning embarrassment into reform. The headlines wanted a scandal, but the king's final response would turn the episode into something more lasting, a lesson about trust, authority, and the future of the crown. In the end, the stranger inside Balmoral was not a spy, and the stopped briefing did not expose some grand conspiracy against the crown. What it exposed was more believable, and in some ways more dangerous. A household where familiarity had begun replacing procedure. Charles could have dismissed the incident as an embarrassing misunderstanding. Instead, he used it to redraw the boundaries around royal authority. And that decision changed the meaning of everything that happened that morning. Charles read the final internal review without interruption. It concluded that the aide had entered through a chain of informal assumptions rather than deliberate deception, clearing him of any organized attempt to infiltrate the royal household. An internal review was the palace's own examination of how staff decisions and security procedures had failed. The finding brought relief, but not comfort. The king understood that an innocent mistake could still become dangerous when nobody knew exactly where authority began or ended. Camilla accepted the new restrictions only after a difficult private conversation with Charles. The queen consort understood that continuing to defend the old arrangement would make it appear that her personal comfort mattered more than security around the monarch. She did not like the changes, and he knew it. But for the first time, both accepted that trust inside the family could not replace clear rules inside the institution. William refused to treat the outcome as a victory. The prince told his father that he had never wanted to prove anyone wrong. He had wanted to stop one careless exception from becoming something far worse. Charles heard the difference. The king also accepted his own responsibility, remembering that he had approved the first exception weeks earlier. Leadership, he now understood, sometimes required admitting that a decision had been wrong instead of defending it because pride made retreat uncomfortable. Then came the next Balmoral briefing. Charles paused at the doorway while an equerry checked every name against the approved attendance list. An equerry was a trusted royal officer who helped manage official duties and access around the sovereign. William was already seated inside. The king looked toward his son and gave one quiet nod. The prince returned it. Nothing more needed to be said. That small exchange carried the real verdict. The incident had strengthened Charles's trust in William because the future king had spotted danger without turning concern into personal warfare. It had also forced the monarch to choose responsibility over convenience. There was nothing left to investigate, and no mystery left unresolved. One unfamiliar face had forced the royal household to examine itself, and Charles's answer was final. Family may depend on trust, but the crown must also depend on rules. Trust remained. But from that day forward, trust had boundaries. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.